How's our handout distribution? They're not necessary, I guess. But what is necessary? Any extras? Anybody need a handout from the pastor? Hand up for handout. I know. Good. Okay. Let's begin. At the top of the handout, there is a verse from the New Testament, the letter of James. Where do wars and where do the conflicts among you come from? Is it not from your passions that make war within your members? Let us pray. Almighty Father, pour out your Holy Spirit upon us, as you did upon your church in the beginning, when, united with Mary, the Mother of God, the apostles and the disciples, received your Holy Spirit, received a gift of wisdom and of peace, to have all things in common, to be of one heart and mind in you. Through the intercession of Our Lady of Victory and Our Lady of Peace, may you bless our hearing, our understanding, our speaking, and our fellowship here tonight. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. This verse was one of the readings at Mass not too long ago when we were going through the letter of James. It's sort of a remarkable place to start. Where do wars come from? They come from the passions that make war within your members. So war somehow has its source in us. And the source of war being within us makes us wonder, well, could we maybe get rid of it? Could we maybe be different or act differently? Or maybe come up with some sort of system to eliminate this? So, in the Christian tradition, there is a way of thinking about war, reflecting about war, as if maybe it were something that could be eliminated. So, it seems that that is not working. It doesn't seem to have happened. The wars seem to be continuing. And this was something that it was, I don't know, a big concern of mine growing up as I read the Bible and just, came of age in the era of 2003, the second Iraq invasion, which was a time which people argued over whether it was a just or unjust war. And so I think that as I was coming to study the faith and even become more and more in the direction of embracing the Catholic faith as a teenager and as a college student, this was one of the questions that really kind of got me interested in the church's tradition. So I think if there's going to be one take, I'm going to kind of ramble through the way that the church has treated this idea of the just war. But if there's one thing that you can take away, here's what I think we can take away about the counsel to eliminate war in our own lives. Is it possible to, as a Christian, be without war, to be a person of peace? And this is, I think, kind of my final thought about this. And this is kind of, I got help for this from Father James Brent, who's a Dominican friar, who's a philosophy professor and a good speaker. I'd recommend you look up his stuff online. Father James Brent is a great preacher. And he suggested thinking about the challenge of peace in terms of a council. So can anyone tell me what the councils are in the Christian tradition? What are the councils? And that's councils with an S, not councils with a C-O-U-N-C-I-L. It's C-O-U-N-S-E-L. So what are the councils? Does anybody know? Okay, how about this? What are the Evangelical Councils? Does that help? Okay. Oh, Ryan? Okay, and what does that mean? Poverty. Like, in what sense? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, to be personally poor, owning nothing of yourself. Okay, so poverty, chastity. Everyone's called to chastity, but this is chastity in the special sense of not getting married, of sacrificing marriage and being celibate. So celibate chastity. And then the third one, obedience. So taking a vow to be obedient to someone. So I have a certain relationship to all of you in this room. As a Christian, I owe you certain things, but to only one of you do I owe obedience, to my legitimate superior here. He's in the second row. So as people who live a life consecrated to God in a particular way, we form our lives through this idea of the councils, that there are things that all Christians are called to, but there are some specific things which some Christians are called to, which go beyond what everyone is called to. So living a life of poverty, not possessing anything of your own, celibacy, so singleness for the kingdom of God, and then obedience. So these are called the Evangelical Councils. And what makes these interesting is that they're part of the gospel. They're clearly part of what Jesus came to do, to say, to bring, but they're not necessarily something that can be applied to everyone at all times. So as I was getting interested in Christianity, I was really moved by these things that Jesus would say about violence, that it seemed like he was calling Christians to abandon retaliation in a way that was really kind of strange, really kind of counterintuitive. So that if you were hit on one cheek, you should offer the other cheek. Offer no resistance to one who does violence to you. And so this seemed to have a lot of repercussions. I didn't really see anyone living this way, and I was attracted to a kind of school of Christianity, a school of thought. I mean, you'll see this in Pennsylvania in particular. This is kind of a Mennonite thing. So the idea that Christians are separate from society and that they are pacifists or refuse to participate in war or violence of any sort. Okay. So this is a radical form of Christian life, which, to many people seems like not practical, like Jesus must not have meant that. And to other people, it's really like inspiring. It's inspired different movements within the church, different gatherings of Christians have gotten together, impelled, moved by this call of Jesus to turn the other cheek, to offer no resistance, and therefore to abstain from any participation in war. So, which makes you kind of a strange person. You have to be in a separate community in some sense, living by a different code of thought. But I just thought when I was growing up, learning about Christianity, like, yeah, it's serious. You're being called out of the world to live in a different way that's going to hurt, it's going to alienate you, and it's going to cause you to look outside of this world for your real home. But that's many aspects of Christianity call us to that. So I found this compelling. However, the more I kind of looked over the Christian tradition, the more I sort of read theology and also like literature, I found that it wasn't so simple. One example would be, I don't really like poetry anymore, but I liked reading poetry in high school, in college, and there was this interesting little strand of poetry that arose out of World War I. So World War I, one novel gives us a phrase that sort of describes how people experienced World War I on the battlefield. It's called storm of steel. In World War I, there was a new experience of war, like this sort of supernatural explosion of violence. New machinery, new kind of ruthlessness was being employed, and this had different effects on people. So there were some Catholic poets who were called like the war poets, who were moved by this to abandon war. So there was a pacifist Catholic tradition of poetry that came out of this. One guy with a very funny name, Siegfried Sassoon. Okay, so there was a number of these war poets. But then I discovered there was this other poet who was also a devout Catholic, a very interesting painter named David Jones. He was part of these different Catholic movements involving like G.K. Chesterton, kind of medieval life of working with your hands and being close to the land. And he fought in World War I as well. He was a Welshman. And he loved it. He thought, this is awesome. It's like I'm living in Homer's Iliad. It's like I'm in an epic poem. There's just explosions going off and people are doing courageous things and just stuff's getting blown away. It's awesome. So he just like really embraced it. And this was confusing to me. It's like, okay, so you have these serious Catholics in different ways being confronted by war in its most shocking form. War in its most lawless, disturbing, it was a sort of festival of violence and confusion and political chaos, all kinds of things, World War I. And so I think that it's important to be able to sort of place ourselves as Christians in this confusion, and that's why I offer, so Thomas Aquinas can be very useful for just like, what's the answer here? The questions can be very interesting, but it's also important to say, what's the answer here? And so that's why I want to propose that when it comes to this question about Christian participation in war, I think that Thomas gives a model by talking about what the councils are. So this is the second thing on your handout. The difference between a counsel and a commandment is that a commandment implies obligation, whereas a counsel is left to the option, the choice, of the one to whom it is given. Consequently, in the new law, which is the law of freedom, counsels are added to the commandments, and not in the old law, which is the law of slavery. We must therefore understand the commandments of the new law to have been given about matters that are necessary to gain the end of eternal bliss, heaven, to which end the new law brings us forthwith, but that the counsels are about matters that render the gaining of this end more assured and expeditious. So, why is this useful for thinking about fighting in war versus pacifism? There are commandments, even commandments in the new law, the gospel. Jesus says certain things in the gospel that if we don't do them, we will go to hell. Certain commandments bind us as obligations. And so if we want to go to heaven, we have to follow the commandments of Jesus or else. Okay, so these are commandments. There's other things that Jesus says which are not obligatory. So how does he say it? The counsels are about matters that render the gaining of this end of heaven more assured and expeditious. They're left to the option of the one to whom they are given. So poverty, chastity, and obedience are not obligatory. You do not have to be like me and Father Hyacinth to get to heaven. Not that we're assured a place in heaven. We are striving for it. Our state of life makes it easier to get to heaven as a state of life. But it's an optional part of Christianity. And so I think that Jesus gives us this call to extraordinary nonviolence, and I think it's best to think of it as a counsel. something which is not a commandment, not required for salvation to be a pacifist. However, I was coming into the Catholic Church, I was pleased to see that it seemed like this problem which had torn my mind apart as a younger Christian was sort of just settled by the Catholics. And they said, okay, if you want to go to war, here's how you do it. Here are the rules. And then if you don't want to go to war, a special exception is made for you. The Church affirms the right to conscientious objection and has a tradition of pacifism which is very beautiful, very moving, and which many of the saints have lived out, even though many of them haven't. So I think that that's a useful lens. So I'm going to give that as the takeaway before I get into the rambly part. Okay, good? Okay, so now, something like a little bit of a history of Christianity in terms of this idea of a just war. I've tried to divide it up into 4 moments in the life of the church so far, and using this metaphor of like what a year is like: spring, summer, fall, and winter, which unfortunately leaves us in winter. But I think that's where we are. Okay, so let's talk about the springtime of the church. So, in the early church, the Christians were living in a community that was already like the one I was describing, where people are living in a different kind of way. And so they're kind of strange. They're outside the normal modes of living in the world, in the Roman Empire. So it's kind of natural for them to say, yeah, I mean, if doing magic prevents me from being a Christian, then I'll just give up magic. If being a soldier prevents me from being a Christian, then I'll just give up being a soldier. It was funny, I don't really get this, but being an actor, you couldn't be baptized if you were an actor. I think that the actors in the Roman Empire had to do stuff that would not have been, like the modern day Actors Guild would probably give you like a clause where you don't have to do this kind of scene. I think that maybe Roman actors all had to do un-Christian stuff. So anyway, there was a sense of like, we're a community set apart, living by a different code, and to be like Jesus is a privilege. And so to remove ourselves from all that the Roman Empire asks of us is kind of a joy, it's a freedom. Okay, so you have this kind of developing over time, and one kind of example of this is Martin of Tours. So Martin of Tours, his feast day, kind of ironically, is on Veterans Day in America. But so Martin of Tours was in ancient France, Christian France. He was a soldier, and he had this sort of moment of clarity, moment of revelation or an epiphany, that he said, I'm a soldier of Christ. I can't fight in the wars of this world. So he had this sort of revelation as a soldier, and he walked away from being a soldier. He was challenged. It was like, you're just saying that because you're a coward. He said, no, if you want me to go out naked into battle, I'm perfectly willing to do that. So he wanted to prove that he wasn't being a coward. He was actually following the law of Jesus, which is a more difficult moral burden than what the world would impose. So Martin of Tours became a famous saint, a friend of the poor. You'll see paintings of him taking his clothes and cutting them in half to give half of them to a poor man. So Martin of Tours is this emblem of like Christianity as leaving the world of war for the way of life of the Christians. And he symbolizes the kind of standard up to that point. Okay, so that's the springtime. It's the time of excitement and change. All right, moving on. The second moment in church history. You could talk about a lot of different Christians in this era. So this would be in the same century of St. Martin, but moving forward. The church is becoming successful in its efforts to spread Christianity. People are joining Christianity from all kinds of different walks of life, and even like powerful and influential people, politicians, generals, professors of philosophy are joining Christianity, and it seems like a good thing. It seems like wow, this could really do a lot for the gospel. It could really project the gospel in a lot of ways. So in the East and in the West, in North Africa and Greece and Rome and Spain, you're having all of these sort of elites joining Christianity. And you have the notorious conversion of Constantine, so a Roman emperor, great influence, who declares Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire. So the takeover is really rapidly, kind of shockingly, sweeping over the known world, the sort of European civilized world. Okay. So what you're having is this sort of like harvest. All of these Christians who, through their great courage, through their supernatural intelligence, through their purity and gift of preaching, have caused all of these people to convert, even people who have it going on, people who have all kinds of goods of this world are saying, I want to be a Christian too. So you could look at this as sort of like the harvest of the gospel, raking in the rewards of several centuries of really intense, awesome, moving Christianity, martyrdom for the faith, the example of virginity being a sort of surprising and beautiful thing in the world of unchaste Rome. And so you end up with these Christian theologians coming out of this context of intellectual elite and having to kind of come up with a way of raking in all of the treasures that are coming into the church. So the best example of this is St. Augustine. St. Augustine was, you could think of him as like, he was like the speech writer for the president. Like he was a Christian whose education and whose gifts were so well known that he was basically training politicians in how to be good politicians, how to be good speakers. And he was a philosopher, he was an academic, but like an academic with mass appeal, like the kind of academic that you like get to speak on the news or something like that. So Augustine had a lot of influence in the Roman Empire, and his conversion to Christianity was public. It was a sort of spectacle. And so a lot of young, ambitious, but religiously interested Christians would come to him and be like, hey, what am I supposed to do? Like, I kind of want to be a Christian. I'm very curious about this Christianity thing. But, like, do you really not retaliate when people kill your family? Or when they invade your country? Do you just, like, let that go? You don't use, like, the death penalty? So Augustine was receiving letters from a lot of these Roman politicians throughout the empire who were very influential, and he sort of has to think through war, specifically war. So he does it. Augustine is an extremely powerful mind and a prodigious writer. He wrote over 5 million words, and his letters are one of the best sources of his thought on this, but he also wrote this book called The City of God, where he tries to sort of lay out how, yes, Christians are called to citizenship in heaven, first of all. We live in a city which we share with the angels. It's an invisible city, won for us by God's grace. But we find ourselves in this world trying to be good as much as we can by that same grace, to be transformed and to transform our families and our friends through the word of the gospel. So he's trying to like help these men and some women to live the life of Jesus as like politicians, as people making important decisions about life and death and about the common good. So the Christian tradition in this age starts to think through how, if we are going to engage in war, we should do it. How should we do it? how should we live out the gospel in a way that seems contradictory? Willing to use violence, willing to coerce our enemies, willing to coerce our religious enemies even, through the power that's just being handed to us, just falling into our laps. So this was what the church found itself asking itself. Okay, so it was a cool time, it was an exciting time, and this just continued to develop. The influence of Christianity spread, even though we hear about the sort of, like that there was a sort of dark age after this in the West. In some ways, yes, in some ways, no. It developed in different nations and places and peoples. And then there was also, in the East, there was a different situation. The empire of Christianity really continued to become more complex, more sophisticated. The laws were developed that became the basis for a lot of Western laws as well. So you have this continuation, even through the so-called Dark Ages, of thought about war, about how to rule, how to be a Christian leader, how to be a Christian general. And so, okay, so what's happening? So we're getting into the point where summer is turning into fall. Okay, so moment 3, fall. Problems of internationalism and Christian empire. So the empire has been converted. What is an empire? If you're in any kind of, if you've been through undergraduate studies, you've probably been taught to hate empire. So what is an empire? Dominic. Yeah, so it's a sort of a nation, but then there's like, it's trying to put other nations under it. So it's a kind of, if you hear this phrase like king of kings, like a king of kings would be an emperor. A king who has other kings, other monarchs, other sovereigns, somehow obedient to him. Even though it seems like what it means to be a king is you're in charge. The buck stops at you. So there's always been this question of nations trying to organize themselves throughout the whole world, and the one who has, aspirations and maybe even the power to rule over them all is an emperor. Early on, for Christians, it was just sort of obvious who the emperor was. The emperor is Jesus. Jesus is the King of Kings. The nations, they all came to him when he was born to give him gifts, to pay him tribute. This was understood to mean he was the emperor. So his kingship meant that kings had to all be obedient to him, and the kings of the world in this era were starting to learn that. But could you have a Christian empire too? Could you have someone on earth who could be like a worldly emperor, like Augustus Caesar? It seemed like maybe you could. Okay, so there's these questions arising over like the wide influence of Christianity over even different kingdoms, not just the Roman Empire, not just the Roman, not just the sort of shell of Rome. Okay, and moving into the Reformation, this kind of came to a boil. So one proposal during the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, was if a king is evil, then Christians don't have to treat him as the king. It was clear in the Bible earlier that, like, whether you were in power or whether you were being persecuted, you have to kind of respect the king. That's in the New Testament. Obey your leaders. All power and authority comes ultimately from God, even if it's wielded by evil people. What the Reformation kind of wanted to say was that, oh, well, if you have these Christian kings, so I'm talking about Luther and Calvin and some of their followers, if you have Christian kings whose kingship is based on being good Christians, then if they stop being good Christians, you can overthrow them. You don't have to obey them anymore. You can revolt against them as a Christian. So this is a problem. That war could not just be something that's being waged between different nations, but that Christians could become revolutionaries, and that this was somehow legitimate. Okay, so the Catholics have to deal with this. So you have a reaction to these proposals from the Christian empire, explaining that, well, we can make a distinction. We can see that kings or rulers of nations are legitimate, and so their power is secular and natural. So that there would be a kind of kingship which doesn't rely on being a Christian, doesn't rely on grace, but it's just a fact of human nature. So this develops out of the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, and you see this especially in the Spanish Empire. So Spain, the time of the discovery of the New World, the enslavement of peoples in the New World, and after the Protestant Reformation, you get this sort of Thomist, that is, in the school of thought of Thomas Aquinas, development of international laws, respect for the law of nations, and a kind of theory of kingship where we have to be obedient to authorities, even though it's not because they're Christian kings. They might be bad Christians, but we have a system of law, of nationhood, of obedience, which needs to be respected. Okay. But what's happening in this era, basically, is like things are falling apart. So Thomism things were going good for Thomism, things were going up. But in terms of order and peace, things were declining. The wars of religion were being born. So in Europe, in the Christian empire that had taken so much, that had brought so much to the world, that had developed such a system of law and reason and rhetoric and governance, it was sort of falling apart. Okay, so. And the Reformation sweeps over Europe. Sometimes the Catholics maintain their system, but in many places, it's over. We lose. The Lutherans are sweeping through. Even Martin Luther loses control of them. They're revolting. They're causing revolts, and Martin Luther's like, I don't know, I can't stop them. So, okay, so there's a sort of decline going on in the sense of our reasonable system of law and war and order it's falling apart, and it's specifically within the Christian empire. Okay, so the final moment I want to talk about, the winter of ambition and disillusionment. Leo XIII was a pope who influenced the church in a lot of ways. He was a pope in the 19th century, and so, like I was saying, this Catholic Thomistic system of order kind of gradually crumbled in terms of its influence and its unanimity. Leo XIII wanted to bring it back. Leo XIII was learned. He was very intelligent in a lot of ways, and he wanted to bring back the old Catholic ideas of order, of respect for nationhood, for property, and so he had a big influence in the church, sort of reigniting the study of these things. He wanted to rediscover our tradition. And he was really into basically bossing around the world. So he wanted to spread this doctrine of the just war, of private property, of reason and order, and he did a lot to help that. And in a way, we're still living in what's called the Leonine revival of Thomism. Okay, so from this perspective, we can see that what's happened is, the world has sort of fallen, things have fallen apart. The grasp of Christianity on the way that nations wage war has kind of weakened. But the Catholic Church wants to back somehow. So we're really hoping that we can retake the territory that we lost. Interestingly, I would say that this culminated in Vatican II. So the First Vatican Council is maybe lesser known, and in the First Vatican Council, the Church stated in strong terms her authority over the mind and over faith. And then sometime later, some decades later, there was a Second Vatican Council. In many ways, it was very different from the First Vatican Council. But if we think about it in terms of the ambition of the Church to reclaim the whole world, in a certain sense, that is what Vatican II wanted to do. Vatican II was an attempt to reclaim the whole world. The ambition of Vatican II was to not be closed in on ourselves, but to open ourselves out, to bring the light of the nations back into the world, and to bring the tradition of peace and order and justice, of love and light and grace back into the world, which had grown cold and dim in these things. Okay, so it was a time of great optimism. It was the 60s. There were statements about, we're not going to have war ever again. Okay, if you're going to claim that we're going to totally eradicate war, who do you think you are? You're the emperor. It's making a global claim on the whole world. So it's like the church saying, we're bringing the light of Christ, and you're all going to stop fighting. Total pacification. A pacifier can mean different things. It can mean like this, and I think that peace and love in one sense, but also in another sense, everybody needs to listen up, and we need to get this stuff in order. So this is following World War I, World War II, and there was a sense of collaboration, a sense of international cooperation, and this is the spirit of Vatican II in a certain sense. Okay. So, did that work? Not really. It didn't really happen. The international optimism that followed World War II bore a lot of different fruits, but I'd say that today we're seeing its disintegration in certain ways. We're seeing that the hope of the church to dictate rules for conduct to the whole world, people didn't all flock back into the Catholic Church after Vatican II. In fact, a lot of people left the church. So, it didn't take yet. Maybe it'll take over the next 100 years. Councils can take a while to play out. But so far, it seems like the hope of Vatican II didn't really play out. Vatican II said things like, nuclear weapons are an utterly unacceptable form of waging war. Vatican II based itself on the just war teaching. So throughout this whole history, the church is developing rules. In the Thomistic school of Vitoria and his students, there's an elaborate set of rules for war, and more or less ignored, but that would articulate how to have a just war. And so, so that's a sort of sense of the history, and now, if you don't like that stuff, here is just the cut and dried version of the rules. This is from the Catechism. So this is the current law of the church. So Catechism of the Catholic Church, 2309. The strict conditions for legitimate defense by military force require rigorous consideration. So I'm sure that everyone, before they go to wage war, that consults the Catechism, and they're like, yes, rigorous consideration. I'm going to follow these strict. Okay, so we hope they will. But, whether they do or not, it's not clear that our ambitions have been fulfilled. But the truth is important, and so we still spell it out. The gravity of such a decision makes it subject to rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy at one and the same time. And so the Catechism reduces, I didn't finish this handout, I see. Okay. The Catechism reduces the requirements for a just war to these four things. The damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. So you can't go to war against someone unless the danger that they pose to you is serious destruction. Like, you can't go to war with someone just because you want to take them over. They have to be threatening you. Okay. Second, all other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. So you have to have tried everything else. Embargoes, international alliances, taxes and negotiation, and what's that? Sanctions. Thank you, that's the word. Yeah, sanctions. We always say, like, we've tried all the sanctions. Okay, so all the other methods have been tried and found wanting. There must be serious prospects of success. Seems reasonable. And then the use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modern means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition. So this is the basis of a radical critique of war. Benedict XVI, Pope Benedict, he has this interview from 2005 where he talks about this a lot, so that's helpful. As you can see, I was going to find a nice little short quote that would fit on the rest of this page. And then, I don't know, I guess I got distracted. I hit print. But it's worth looking into. Basically what he says is, considering that you can't use arms that produce evils graver than the one that you're trying to solve, is it even possible for us to wage a just war? Since our weapons seem to have a lot of complications which might cause more damage than what they're meant to prevent. So he says that, in a sort of general sense, he says, these standards, in a way, need to be updated. So Benedict XVI thinks that the standards for just war should be maintained, and they need to be updated. Some people say we should get rid of the theory of just war. They say we should return to an early spirit of Christian pacifism. And this was, sort of what I was talking about early on. This was very attractive to me. Like, yeah, what are we doing? Messing around with war. So there's a radical critique of the just war theory that says we should just eliminate it from our Catholic vocabulary. The standard should be the early church and the strict pacifism which she practiced, and we can't be letting Christians be in the military. Shouldn't be allowed. Okay, so what Benedict says about war seems to kind of suggest that maybe no war could be just, and so you could say, therefore, why would anybody join the military? Okay. That doesn't seem, all in all, to be like a helpful conclusion to me. Having thought about this, I want to then, once again recommend this idea of pacifism in the Catholic Church as a council. So it's something that we can't ignore as part of the Christian tradition and as one of the driving forces for, like, the way that the Holy Spirit shows his glory in the world. The martyrs. The martyrs are the engine that makes the church grow. So the martyrs are those who were killed for the faith, and resisting unjust participation in certain things is often what makes you get martyred. So this is just like, it's an essential ingredient for the church. So that there would be these sorts of people who refuse. Another modern day example is Franz Jägerstätter. So he was in this movie that came out pretty recently called The Hidden Life. Sorry, he was not in it. It's based on him. In fact, he is a hilarious little German peasant and he's played by this really angsty, kind of like angular-looking European guy, which is not what he looks like at all. But it's a Terrence Malick movie, so it's pretty, it's moving. And so he's an example of someone who was just like, I'm a Catholic, I'm not going to be in the Nazi military. And he was martyred, and now he's a shining example of like the cost and the glory of the cross of Jesus Christ. However, can everyone be a pacifist? No, I don't think so. Should we support Christians who are in the military? Yes. Can Christians in the military cultivate Christian virtues and even spread their faith through acts of those virtues in the military? Yes, I think so. I've seen this. I think many people have seen this. I think, in fact, that's more often what we see, is that people who are willing to dedicate themselves to the defense of their country, who are willing to cultivate, honor and fortitude and justice, and even put this under the idea of love, that you would do this not out of hatred but out of love, are also an important part of Christianity. So I think they should be allowed to be baptized. Maybe even more than actors should be allowed to be baptized. And so I just offer these, so this idea of the pacifism of the church's tradition as something like one of the councils. It's not one of the traditional three councils of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but it's like it. Here's a little sort of sketch of the way that the church developed through history, and then these are the terms that the church at present, the imperfect terms that the church at present gives us for evaluating a war. So, thank you for your attention. Questions? Amar. Yeah. So it's tough. This was what absorbed my attention for about a year of my life. When I became Catholic, I was really moved by Dorothy Day and the tradition of sort of nonviolence that she started in the church. And I tried that Catholic worker thing. It didn't really work out. So I went to this nonprofit it was a Catholic nonprofit in DC focused on nuclear disarmament. I was like, all right, there's one thing we know. It's that Catholics we can't accept nuclear weapons. Popes have said it. It's in Vatican II. It's clear. There's a lot of ambiguity in war. You talk about gun control and all the disagreements that people have about that kind of thing, but it's like, we can agree on this, right? No, turns out we can't. So there are strong condemnations of just like the existence of nuclear weapons, but the way to get rid of them, I don't know, it's not at all clear. Do you know how many nuclear bombs there are in the world? Hundreds? There's over 15,000. So it's like the problem of nuclear disarmament is extremely difficult, practical problem. Like, even if we wanted to get rid of them all. Apparently the United States has 6 nuclear weapons where it's like, we're not sure where they are. I don't know why I'm telling you this either, because this was like the most demoralizing thing to me. I was just like, yeah. Anyway, that's not really what your question was about. Well, in a way, okay, so it's like there's this theory of, competitive nuclear stockpiles meant to, ensure peace. Speak softly but carry a big stick. So, so can you arm yourself, more than Russia so that Russia won't bomb you? Well, that's what we did, and it worked. And now we have a ton of nuclear weapons, and there's sort of political posturing that goes on over, it's like who's going to them, and you get some virtue points for that. So like, I'm very confused about what the question even is with nuclear weapons anymore. Is it like, how do we safely dispose of them? Like, does everyone agree? Do all the leaders of the nations agree that like we should probably try to get rid of them, and we're just not sure like who's going to go first? So yeah, I started to realize that like the actual questions are not the ones that, Vatican II and papal documents address. It's more like practical, political questions about like I think that like us and Russia and maybe even China probably agree like we don't really like having all of these sitting around. Like, how do we get rid of them? So, so in a way, it's like I felt like the speculative question, the sort of abstract questions about nuclear war, changed into like there's more concrete political questions about how to deal with the present arsenals that people have, and you see that it's mostly used as a way of stronger nations manipulating others through like we're going to give Iran nuclear capacity. So, there's a sort of surface level conflict, which is about Iran having nuclear weapons, but the real conflict is between the United States and its rivals in, sort of larger geopolitical picture. I don't know what geopolitical means, but that's what you say in this context. As for like sort of preemptive war, yeah, it's basically, I think that, especially since Vietnam and then into the era of terrorism, you can sort of talk about war in classical terms as nations declaring it against one another, but in reality, it seems like it's not, the war on terror is not it's not a war that you can understand according to old school terms about nations. I think that we can, and as Christians have to try to observe these classical concepts and be like, well, okay, we're not going to wage war on Afghanistan. We're going to, do collaborative police operations against them with Pakistan. So, yeah, so it's like, it's hard to know what to do. And as someone who was looking into the Catholic Church, I was very moved by the fact that like the bishops of the Catholic Church, who I was sort of led to believe were these like mean conservatives, they unanimously said that like the invasion of Iraq was an unjust war. That's what Pope John Paul II said. So it's like, okay, well, they weren't being good Republicans. They were saying that like we're Christians and you can't invade Iraq because you don't like have a justification for it. Some Catholics certainly disagreed with the bishops, and they sort of said like, no, look through these things. It's like they have weapons of mass destruction. We've tried everything else. We tried reasoning with Saddam Hussein. He won't listen. We're not going to nuke them. We're going to, we're using these other very deadly techniques. So I was moved, at least, by the fact that like the bishops were saying something which wasn't really heard. It wasn't very pragmatic, but they were just like, yeah, you do not have our support in this. And they were, it was one of these examples of like, oh, we have this whole sort of tradition that we put forward and people totally ignore it. So that's why I sort of say that, you have this ambition in the 60s, and the world was like listening. It was like a time when bishops would get on TV and people would all watch it. So it was a time of real prophecy. The Holy Spirit was really doing something. And there was a real expectation, like maybe we're going to have this sort of like international, interreligious government. We're going to have like peace and cooperation. And it just didn't really happen. And so now you see more like the bishops are, their job is to preach the gospel, and I think in that instance they did. And that was moving to me anyway. But as for, what is their actual say in addressing questions of preemptive war or nuclear arsenals, like nobody's consulting them. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's a little bit of personal testimony, I guess. Question? More questions?
You mentioned a little bit in
Do I feel like what? Yeah, I mean, the premise, and I think it's true, behind the just war theory is that like many parts of Catholic teaching, it's based on nature, and so it's true and it works. And in a way, the Catholic claim to understand nature was in a big way what the sort of scientific revolution challenged and what the Protestant Reformation also challenged. So on two fronts, sort of modern science and the Protestant Reformation, it was just like, you're using these old ideas of nature based on nothing, based on like Aristotle, and you're treating the world like something that you're able to understand and talk about it in a way that's coherent, and it's like, nature needs to be tortured so that she gives up her secrets, says Francis Bacon, and to rely on the features of human nature as if they were still whole and integral is like idolatry, and Christians have no business talking about nature. That's like Martin Luther, basically. So I think, I would maintain against both of those positions, like in the sort of classical way of thinking, but also in a very modern American way of thinking, like, no, nature is real. We can study it. We can understand it. And by understanding it, we find true power, true sources of stability and peace, and yeah, that's what the just war theory is about. So it's like, it's based on a very, I think for us it's very difficult to sort of see this, but like this idea of human nature is that the societies that we create, not only our families, but also cities and even maybe nations, are natural beings. They're not mere contracts. They're not just agreements at mutual protection. They're real beings. Some people want to caution against it. Don't say that they're organic. They're not real in the sense that like a mushroom is real and a dog is real. They don't have cells. But they are real in the sense that laws of motion are real, that logic is real, that they exist and they exert force. So, so the reason that the just war theory, even if it's ignored, and even if you sort of fall behind the pack by following these kind of like old school ideas about justice and society and just human polity, it's a long game, potentially. I mean, the world could end tomorrow, and then we won't have to worry about this. But if human civilization continues for 1,000 more years or 10,000 more years, I think that what will endure is, a way of thinking that respects the realities of human and political nature, that thinks about them seriously and doesn't have contempt for them or isn't like skeptical of their existence. So that's what you get in a lot of modern and Reformation thinking, is like, don't try to reason about human nature and political life. Like, it's a mess. You can look at this either like Machiavelli and be like, it's a mess that's just there to be taken advantage of, or like Luther and be like, it's a mess that we have no business trying to fix. I think really, it's like the Catholic tradition is to say, it's a fallen nature, but it's still trucking. The metaphor that St. Thomas uses for sin, what sin does to us, is that it's like a limp. So when like eating is good, so we should eat. We have a natural desire and a need to eat, and what happens? Well, our desire to eat gets thrown off by sin, and then we start to like eat, but eat in the wrong way, either too much or too little. So it's like a limp, where there's a natural way of walking, and if you get injured in your hip, like you're still walking, but you're just not walking great. So the same thing can be said in broad terms, that we can look at human nature, the way that nations are supposed to interact or cities are supposed to interact, be like, they're doing it. We can know things about how they work, but they're doing it with a limp. So this sort of like a Catholic understanding of politics would be like, it works according to certain rules, but it's also inclined towards disorder and decay. So sin has its effects on our political life. But that doesn't mean we should throw away all of the kind of reasoning that we've been able to do about it. Yes?
Please say some thoughts. So great job. I guess two thoughts that I was thinking about in terms of adding. I think, so if you look it up in the Catechism, this is under the fifth commandment. So it's kind of, I think one thing that's useful to know is, this month we're going over the social teachings of the church. One of the things that the Catechism does is you have all these different social issues, and often fits them under different commandments that deal with sort of different areas of life. So obviously this is under the fifth commandment, do not kill. So, and there's one absolute, because we're made in the image and likeness of God, the absolute is we can never directly kill innocent human life, because human life has great value. And I think there are three instances, so that's like an absolute, you can never do that, right? But then there's these difficult questions that arise, and in my mind, it's sort of like three different areas, where you have self-defense. What happens if somebody's coming after you or a loved one and they're killing? You think of it as sort of an active shooter, for example. Can you, obviously you want to sort of render them just, unable to continue to do that. And sometimes it's like it might be the only practical way is to shoot and try to kill them in order to stop the shooting, to defend the innocent, right? So self-defense would be one, just war is the second, and then capital punishment is the third. And in all three cases, you're dealing with an unjust aggressor. So it's different. You're not dealing with an innocent human being. But I think there's this general principle that even with an unjust aggressor, we don't want to kill them unless it's sort of last resort. And sort of there's all other means have been exhausted, and it's to defend the innocent, that kind of thing. So self-defense is more immediate. Just war, I think, is more sort of immediate. I think one of the reasons the church has really tried think about Hitler or Stalin, right? These are really egregious, unjust aggressors that need to be repelled in some way. Now, how you do that, that's another question. But even if there's that situation, usually the way war should be engaged is you never kill innocents. You try to avoid killing civilians at all costs, right? And you're really trying to target those who are the unjust aggressors, which the leaders, and then, with association with them, those who are fighting with them, and so on. So I think that's an important point too. Is the you really try as much as possible to really safeguard innocence. And the last slide, and this is just my own thoughts, but like you brought up, preventing war and nuclear stockpiles and things like that. So the way I think about it is, I think one of the problems with a nuclear weapon is it's indiscriminate. There's no way you can just go after those who are the unjust aggressors who are the threat. It's going to kill innocent other people too. And people will try to justify it by saying, oh, well, it's just an unintended consequence. But the fact is, the very action of dropping a bomb on a population is going to kill innocent people. And that's why it's so horrific and evil. So the use of nuclear weapons, I think, I don't see how that can be moral. I think having them, I think that's a little bit of a different question, because then you're getting into real politique. Because in my mind, I'm not speaking on behalf of the church here, I'm just giving my own thoughts. But you have some really, very evil people in the world, and some of them are in charge of nations or groups, like Taurus, like North Korea, right? And these people, they don't listen to, you don't just sit down with them and try to, people try all these kinds of things. They kind of need to know, it's just like somebody who's doing evil kind of needs to know that there are consequences to actions, and that if you're not careful, there are going to be some consequences here. Because that kind of, having that kind of stance, I think, actually can prevent war, it can prevent a lot of innocence, from them taking advantage of you. So I don't know, how, it's messy, but I personally, I think there can be, when you're dealing with the real world with these bad actors, you have to be kind of a tough guy to some extent. You should never do anything immoral, never kill innocents, avoid war at all costs. But also, personally, I think that they should know that you better not try, anything, because there will be consequences. Obviously, it's best if you involve the international community and allies and do whatever you can. Anyways, those are kind of some various thoughts.
When I was thinking about becoming a Dominican, I went and visited the House of Studies in D.C., where our seminary, and I was coming from this world of like Dorothy Day kind of nuclear disarmament type stuff, and I was at a breakfast table with a bunch of Dominicans, and one of them was explaining, he's like, well, nuclear weapons are, you could reasonably detonate one off the coast of a country to cause like a massive tsunami, and that'd be a legitimate use of it. What the heck? That was a strange new world for me. So, okay, any last question? Right. Well, I'm sure some people in Britain thought Philadelphia was just a slave revolt going on in 1776, don't you think? No, I mean, so are you asking, like, what is a nation? Yeah. I don't think the nation is defined in the catechism. I don't think I could define nation. I mean, that's one of these really weird entities in just like human thought, I think. Because I mean, originally a nation meant like, I mean, it was racial. It was a racial unity. Obviously, that's not how we mean it now. Although you could look back and be like, well, I mean, the ancient nations or kingdoms anyway, would have seen themselves as multiracial. You conquer different nations, they become part of your nation or your kingdom anyway. So no, I think that's, I mean, I was wondering how much to talk about this like nation thing because I think it's a very interesting question. It's very much, I think, moves parallel to the question of just war. I mean, in a way, so Francisco de Vitoria, Dominican friar, star of the Salamanca school. He was most famous for, taking these principles of just war, especially from Thomas Aquinas, but also like contemporary law, and applying them in terms of the conquest of the New World and the treatment of the indigenous people there. And so it's like you had Spain doing its thing, marching in and like in some ways doing good things, spreading the gospel, but in many ways doing it in a way that really didn't reflect well on Christianity. I mean, this was obvious at the time as well. It's not like everyone thought that things were going great. And Vitoria, who was not some like radical, who's just like, yeah, you gotta, I mean, we can't just claim that our nation immediately extends over these civilizations just because like we're able to conquer them. There has to be some logic of, if people have a government of some kind, that you can't simply impose your law on them, and if you're going to fight them, it has to be provoked by some kind of violence. So Vitoria is, considered sort of not the father, but maybe the grandfather of international law. International law sort of comes a bit later, but the law of nations, the sort of thinking about natural law in terms of the interactions of different nations, and then this, of very radically different cultures, was the kind of problem that he was trying to work through. And he was a theologian, so he was doing it. It's interesting to read his writings because it's using contemporary law and things like that, but it's also just in light of the gospel. But yeah, I mean, so I think that, yeah, the question of like, what is nationhood kind of grows up along with the Catholic just war tradition, you could say, and it's never really, I don't think, resolved. We have a certain way of talking about nations now in sort of United Nations-ese, but it's largely based on kind of like a right of self-government, and it's contractual and things like that. So it's not, it's a bit outside, or at least somewhat alien to the Catholic tradition. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Any announcements?